Hey everyone, it's Blake Lovell, and welcome in to the 411 on Wrestling Podcast. On today's episode of the podcast, I am flying solo here as we look at some quick hitter topics in the world of professional wrestling. And let's start with the upcoming Impact Rebellion pay-per-view, which is going to take place on Sunday, headlined by the big title versus title match featuring Kenny Omega versus Rich Swann. Before we get into that match, let's talk about the card itself, which is going to feature Finjuice taking on the Good Brothers for the Impact World Tag Team titles. You've got Ace Austin taking on Josh Alexander and TJP for the Impact X Division Championship. Deonna Purrazzo defends her Impact Knockouts title against Tennille Dashwood. Trey Miguel taking on Sami Callihan. Matt Cardona, one-on-one with Brian Myers. Then you also have Chris Sabin, Eddie Edwards, James Storm, and Willie Mack going up against Violent by Design, which is Eric Young, Diener, Joe Doring, and Rhino. And you've also got Jordan Grace and a partner to be determined taking on Fire and Flava, which is Kiera Hogan and Tasha Steele. So a pretty good lineup there for the Impact Rebellion show. But obviously, again, all the attention is going to be on the main event and really the outcome of the main event there, because it is not often, of course, that we see a cross-promotional title versus title match when you talk about two promotions of this magnitude. Of course, AEW, if you look at the ratings recently since, the quote-unquote Wednesday Night War that was having AEW and NXT on the same night, both companies doing pretty well now that they've split with NXT on Tuesdays, AEW on Wednesdays, and AEW's done a pretty good job thus far in the ratings, getting over 1 million in the viewership, and so they have to be happy with that. But that also brings up the question of, this match in and of itself, and what does it do for both parties involved? Because the main theme has been the fact that AEW really hasn't mentioned this match much at all on their programming. I know some have discussed it, sort of just playing up the storyline of Tony Khan and doing the paid ads and those kind of things, and basically just not bringing it up much at all, knowing that I'm not sure how they want to promote this, but this has really been an Impact first type thing where Impact has done sort of the heavy lifting on this in terms of the promotion of the match. You had the press conference, which I thought was done really, really well in terms of doing the press conference to hype up this match. I thought that made it have sort of a big match feel, which it is. And you're also bringing in more Ronaldo to call the match. You also, I thought Impact did a really good job too, having him do some of these specials. And, they brought in other people as well to kind of really help build up this match between these two. But it does beg the question, is this going to be as predictable as some people think, wherein is going to be the scenario that Kenny Omega, walks out of Rebellion with the Impact title? I think at this point, this is obviously another step in the working relationship between these two. We know there's the potential for others to be involved, whether that's New Japan and elsewhere. But I think this is certainly a scenario where you just are looking ahead and wondering how you can come up with something here to where Kenny Omega loses this match. I don't necessarily just see that happening. I think, again, I know it seems predictable in terms of where this is headed, but sometimes that's best for the bigger picture and the bigger story. Would this be a huge boost for Rich Swann? Absolutely, if he were to win this match. And that's where I think the questions have come in. Well, if Rich Swann's actually going to wind up winning this thing, AEW has really not mentioned him, at all whatsoever in terms of their promotion of this. So I think that is something that you certainly think about in the back of your head if you're trying to find scenarios here to where maybe this is one of those just completely shocking type moments in wrestling where Swann actually wins this match. I, again, don't see it myself, just in terms of that happening. But I do think it's going to be interesting in terms of how they go about the finish here. Is it just a straight, clean Kenny Omega pins Rich Swann to win the Impact title? Is that the scenario? Because, one of the things they teased as well at the press conference was there's going to be referees from both promotions involved here. So you'll have an AEW referee, you'll have an Impact referee. I know some have wondered, does that mean there's going to be some type of shenanigans at the end. I have a feeling there's going to be some shenanigans. I don't know if it's going to necessarily be the thing at the very end of the match that factors into, the 1, 2, 3. But you have to believe with the elite on the prowl and other potential options there, you feel like that there could be some sort of shenanigans involved here, whether that's someone helping Omega or however you want to look at it. But you have to believe that that could be an option, or maybe they do just go straight up wrestling match where you have these two guys, a really big fight feel. And one of those situations where they can just make this a true wrestling match. Because again, you do have Morrow on commentary. You've really kind of hyped this up on Impact side, of course, as this being just a huge, huge deal. And maybe that is the way they go. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of involvement with the elite here. I know some have also said, could this be one where they just do not have a finish? I just cannot see that happening. I don't think you can do that for a match like this where, all of a sudden it just comes out and you get sort of a no finish and it's just pretty much chaos and you got a brouhaha everywhere. I don't see that happening. I just don't think you can do that on pay-per-view at this point, especially given what they've done to build up this match. You're bringing in Morrow, like we said, the press conference, all this other stuff. I just don't think you can do that. So the most likely scenario for me, if I'm a betting man, if there are betting sites out there, which I'm sure there are that have betting odds on this match, I'm probably betting on Kenny Omega because that seems to be the direction they're going as the belt collector for him to pick up the Impact title. But this is going to be very intriguing. I mean, any way you look at it, I still think it's, there's obviously something that can sell you on this match, even if you think that you have a pretty good idea of who's going to win. I think there's still some intrigue involved in how they do it, and then maybe what the next step is after that. If Omega does win, is there something in the post match? Is there a big angle? Is there something like that that could sort of lead into that next program or maybe the next step for both of these promotions? So I think that's an appealing aspect of having this as your main event as well. So we'll see how it turns out at Impact Rebellion. I think it's going to be a good pay-per-view. Like I said, it's really not just this one match. I mean, I think you've got some good matches on this card. This, to me, feels like one of Impact's better cards in recent months overall. So I think this could actually be a pretty fun show from top to bottom. So should be interesting, again, to see how everything plays out with the main event, but you've also got some compelling matches elsewhere. So maybe Kenny Omega comes out and you just have sort of the next step in the overarching theme, I think, for him in terms of, the belt collector and all these other things. So we'll see if that's what happens with the main event there when the title versus title match between Kenny Omega and Rich Swann. Also wanted to discuss the post-WrestleMania fallout for WWE. We talked about that on last week's episode of the podcast with Post Wrestling's Andrew Thompson, and we mentioned, the releases were the biggest topic, considering that they had happened, a few hours before we actually recorded. But we did mention some of the post WrestleMania stuff and where does WWE go from here with some of the storylines after WrestleMania. And I think it's been interesting thus far. I did mention in a conversation we had with Andrew last week that I think one of the things WWE has struggled with at times, and this is nothing new. I mean, people have brought this up over the years, is that post WrestleMania lull where you don't really know if there's consistency with some of the stories that they do, or if they put their champions or some of their high profile people who maybe get those big moments at WrestleMania necessarily in the best position to follow up on that and keep that momentum going. There's one person in particular that has been able to do that, and that is Cesaro, who got his big singles win at WrestleMania against Seth Rollins. And now it seems like, to this point, while I don't know if this match is going to happen at WrestleMania Backlash, if it's going to be Cesaro versus Roman Reigns for the Universal title, but that is at least the direction it seems that they're heading in to that match at some point, whether that is, as soon as WrestleMania Backlash or if it's later down the road. But I do think it's at least a good sign for Cesaro that he's not just one of those where, as we've said so many times throughout his career, it's a start and stop with him, and it's been that way. You can go back to the Andre the Giant Battle Royal. You can pick other times throughout his tenure in WWE where you felt like, okay, they're finally starting to give him that push, and then it just comes back the other way, and he just kind of levels off into someone that, maybe they just don't really seem to invest in much. But right now, they are clearly invested in Cesaro. They're also clearly invested in the UFO, because I think they showed that many times on the post WrestleMania SmackDown. But clearly, this is the direction they want to go in. And now I think it's just a matter of how far do you go with Cesaro? Because here's the thing, and I wrote this article for 411mania.com. You can find it over there, and I'll link it in the show notes actually, because I would love your feedback. We had a ton of feedback on this article, and I was kind of curious what people were thinking, because it's a very intriguing question. Which this was the title, was who should dethrone Roman Reigns as the Universal Champion? And really, I picked 5 people that I thought could probably be the ones that could do it, and I made my reasoning for all 5. In that some of them, I think, for me personally, I would pick, whether that's, guys like Cesaro, someone like Big E, current roster guys who could really, elevate themselves by being the one to beat Roman Reigns. Or, I also mentioned Drew McIntyre in that category, or, is it going to be the more blockbuster attraction, whether that's Brock Lesnar, whether that's The Rock, down the road? Are they going to be the ones that sort of dethrone Reigns, or are those options that WWE would consider? I don't necessarily, I pointed out in the article, I don't really see it with The Rock, because I don't think that The Rock beating Roman Reigns does anything for Roman Reigns. I think if that match ever actually happens, I think Reigns wins the match. And then with Brock, you never know. We always say that when it comes to Vince McMahon and WWE, you never know if they, kind of get the idea that they want to put the belt on Lesnar. But I think overall, for me, I don't see Cesaro, if they do have this match at WrestleMania Backlash, like many people, and I'm sure most of the people listening right now, you're probably not going to think that Cesaro is going to win this title. One of the things I mentioned in the column as well is I think we're actually looking at a pretty lengthy run here for Roman Reigns. If you were going to take the belt off of him, WrestleMania was the place to do it, because you had Edge, you had Daniel Bryan. I think either one of those guys winning, that sets you off in a new direction. But he pinned both of those guys, and we talked about it with Andrew. It was as dominant of a finish as you could have for a character like Reigns. And so the fact is, now I think you look forward, it's good for Cesaro to be in the spot where he's in the main event segment here with Roman Reigns. And again, probably looking at a match between the two where it's really going to be able to, even if he doesn't win, it's going to do something for Cesaro. And it at least proves that WWE right now sees him as a guy that in that spot against Reigns can really succeed. But I don't necessarily see him being the one to win this right away. Sure, could they do a match here now? Down the road, maybe it's a rematch. You have sort of the redemption path. We've seen redemption stories told over the years in wrestling. That's certainly a possibility, but I don't think anyone's taking the belt off of Reigns just yet. So the fact is, now that they've paired him with Cesaro, that just seems like another sort of stepping stone for Reigns here as he moves throughout his reign. And again, I pointed out in the column, I could see Reigns losing at SummerSlam, maybe, if there's a crowd. It may not be until next WrestleMania. Like, I know that's a long time in WWE, storylines, but I don't think Roman Reigns is losing the title until there is an actual crowd. And if you didn't do it at WrestleMania when you had an actual crowd, then you start to look ahead and say, okay, when's the next time? Because you're not going to waste this type of reign, one of the most well-booked championship reigns that WWE's had in a long time. You're not going to waste that. I think just in the Thunderdome atmosphere. So I think that's what you have to keep in mind here. But still, that doesn't mean we're not going to have a really fun feud here between Reigns and Cesaro, which we're already tying in Jey Uso. And there are a lot of other elements you can tie in. Of course, Seth Rollins is going to be in the mix too. So how maybe Seth factors into things, that's another thing that you kind of look at here. But I think this is clearly, one of the best things they're doing here coming out of WrestleMania is this main event feud on SmackDown with Roman Reigns and Cesaro. On the Raw side, I think the most noteworthy thing, or at least the thing people are talking about the most right now, is the Charlotte Flair suspension after she has kind of, run roughshod over Raw the past couple weeks where she came back after WrestleMania. She had the promo, basically, talking about how she was left out and, she's not going to be in that position. And she's basically taking it into her own hands now. The whole referee thing and all this other stuff they're doing with her. I know there is a certain segment of fans that probably have had their fill of Charlotte over the years, just in terms of the spotlight she's been in, and the high premier matches that she is typically placed in, and the storylines. I mean, she's always at the top. I think when you're talking about the top, women's division storylines in WWE, and that's no different here, as she is factoring into the mix here with Asuka, Rhea Ripley. What direction does that go in? Right now, I mean, there are lots of possibilities. You could do triple threats, you can do single matches. There's a lot of ways they could go with this, but I think it's interesting. I will say that. I mean, it's her not being on WrestleMania. I think that surprised a lot of people in terms of them not using her on the card. And there's a lot of directions you can always go in with Charlotte's character, and this is one that's a little different in terms of what we've seen before, but for me at least, I mean, it's clear. Like she's a natural heel. Like that, we know they've tried to push her as a babyface and all this other stuff in the past, but I think that she's clearly a natural heel. And if there's an audience there, she's getting booed. And I think that especially when you look at what she's doing here recently, the past couple weeks, these are the tactics that you want from a heel. And I think her factoring into the mix here, I'm not sure. One of the things I said earlier about champions being booked after WrestleMania, I don't know what this is necessarily going to do. I feel like Rhea Ripley, for whatever reason, like even winning the belt, I mean, we mentioned a little bit like the match she had with Asuka at WrestleMania was solid, but I don't know that it ever really got a chance to get off the ground. It wasn't a long match. The one they had in the follow up, I didn't think there was obviously some different things that didn't feel like they really clicked with those two necessarily. So I think it's an important kind of point here for Rhea Ripley, and how they actually book this whole storyline and Charlotte's involvement and all that, because you just put the belt on her, and you want to make sure that coming out of WrestleMania again, that's a defining win in her career, is to a year after losing to Charlotte at WrestleMania, she wins the belt. And now what direction do you go in with her? And so I think that's a line that, you have to sort of tiptoe if you're WWE, because you don't want to all of a sudden make Rhea Ripley's reign, quite frankly, what Asuka's reign was, because I thought that Asuka's booking was just at times laughable in terms of, yes, she was the champion, but they did not necessarily do her a lot of favors. And I think that comes back to the overarching theme of WWE's booking as a whole, and just the ability to build up people who aren't necessarily the champions or the ones that get all the TV time. You have to build up your entire roster, and you have to find different ways to do that, whether that's 2-minute promos or 3-minute matches or just anything to build up that lower part of the card, build up your mid card, and not just focus on putting the same matches over and over again, as we've talked about before, with the repeating storylines and repeating matches, 5-match series and all this other stuff. I think that's been one of the flaws of WWE's booking overall, is when you have 3 hours on Monday, you've got your 2 hours of SmackDown on Fridays. There's a lot of time to fill, and I think that they have to do a pretty good job here with Rhea Ripley. And I think at least now, she is paired with Asuka and Charlotte, and there are different pairings you can use here. But I think that's something that's going to be very important to watch here too. Is, yes, Charlotte Flair is kind of the one getting all the attention here, but I think you got to remember that your champion is the one that really needs this big boost right now, after being called up and getting that defining moment at WrestleMania. So I think that's another aspect that you have to look at moving forward with how they book Rhea Ripley as the new Raw Women's Champion. And speaking of new women's champions, Bianca Belair, I said it, we talked about it last week. She feels like a star. Like, she is just one that you saw it at WrestleMania. That match pretty much universally lauded in terms of how well that they executed that. And now, at least, it seems like, you're going to see her tied into the mix with Bayley here in the short term. You have to believe that there's going to be that rematch with Sasha. My guess is, can they hold that off to SummerSlam? If that's sort of the next point you look at and say that's when you're going to have your live crowd for a big event again. If so, I could see them finding a way to hold that off and do that rematch at SummerSlam. Will they do it earlier? Sure, they could. I mean, they could always do that earlier if they want. But I think that's what I look at least right now in the back of my mind. I'm trying to say, okay, if I put myself in WWE shoes, which can be a dangerous thing sometimes, you're thinking about this too from a crowd standpoint. You saw the reaction at WrestleMania. You saw the different things that really stood out and who the crowd supported. I mean, again, Bianca, a huge crowd reaction. Like, and we talked about Cesaro, someone else. These are ones that I think you look at and say, okay, we need to put these people in spots to where when we do have a crowd again, we know the type of reaction, or at least if we can build the people the way we built them going into that WrestleMania, these are people that get reactions. And I think for Bianca, there are a lot worse options than having to pair her with Bayley, who gets back into the mix, into the title picture here, if they do have that match at WrestleMania Backlash. And then again, the Sasha match, they're going to do the eventual rematch at some point. And then it's just a matter of how do you get to that point. And of course, you're tying in Bayley and you've got the whole Bayley Sasha thing. So that is an intriguing storyline, I think, just to kind of see what they do with Bianca here. First, I mean, there hasn't been much since WrestleMania 37, but I just think that she's a star and they need to make sure, they book her as such, because she is one that has all the momentum right now in terms of this company. And I think that, that they certainly need to continue on that front with her. And we'll finish up here. Obviously, there are other storylines in the company, but the main storyline too, I guess, from the men's standpoint on Raw is Drew McIntyre seemingly getting closer, I guess, to the rematch with Bobby Lashley, but he is having to go through T-BAR and MACE to get there. And I can't say this has felt like the strongest WrestleMania fallout and the post-WrestleMania development for Drew McIntyre and Bobby Lashley. If, again, this is what they're heading towards, I just, we said it from the beginning with Retribution. There's only so much you can do, and this was something that was going to sort of follow the characters involved. And I know, that they have moved over. Slapjack and Mia Yim have both been moved to SmackDown, according to the reports. So that's good for them, as they can move away from the Retribution thing. And clearly, they're also moving T-BAR and MACE away from the Retribution idea. They, the unmasking and all this other stuff that they've done here recently, that's a good step, but it's going to take a while, I think, for people to realize that, or maybe, I'm not sure, I would think WWE realizes this, but I'm not exactly sure. You would think that they understand that it's going to take a while for people to actually fully buy into these characters, even if you do have guys like T-BAR and MACE who, are pretty big dudes, and, they can get over with their physicality and their athleticism, but there's still people that a lot of people looked at and said, why should I care or buy into these characters for a very long time with how long this Retribution storyline ran. So I think that, if WWE is expecting them just for everyone to look at them as true threats to Drew McIntyre right now, I think that's hard to do just based off of how they were booked prior to that. And now we're just all of a sudden supposed to care and look at these guys as true, legitimate threats to Drew McIntyre, who is, ran through the entire roster on that side over the past year or so. And I just don't think they've done that yet. And, it's fine to have MVP pulling the strings and all this other stuff, but I think it just goes back to, why do you break up the Hurt Business in the first place if this was the direction you were going to go in? There's just so many other directions I think they could have went with, this whole Drew McIntyre and even just Bobby Lashley as a champ. I just, this is one where WWE has its swings and misses, and this to me thus far, I'm willing to wait, see where it goes from here, but I just think this is one that, you look at the reaction, at least thus far, from wrestling fans, and I just don't know that this is one that's necessarily hitting the way that, for example, a Roman Reigns Cesaro type feud right now is hitting for WWE fans. So we'll see what they decide to do on that front, but at least right now, I think that the McIntyre and having to interact with T-BAR and MACE is is not doing a whole lot for him. Oh, I mean, I understand, for them, it's a big deal because you are trying to present them as a more serious threat versus whatever they were before as Retribution. I don't even know how you would have labeled that. But I think that's good for them. But overall, I think this is sort of one of those, post WrestleMania lulls here in terms of not really knowing if this is the storyline that's maybe going to get over the way they expect it to. And as for everything else, if you want me to get into the whole Nia Jax slipping and just that whole ordeal, I can't. I'm sorry, folks. I just can't do it. But anyways, lots going on in the world of professional wrestling. You can find it all over at 411mania.com. Check out all the reviews we have. We've got lots of news, of course. We're bringing back some really exciting columns. Tony Cesaro has brought back the 3 R's, a longtime favorite on 411, so you can check that out for thoughts on all the big shows each week. As I mentioned earlier, I'm doing some columns. You can check out my Roman Reigns column I have over there. I'm also currently putting together a column on the most underutilized talent in WWE. Kind of goes into the theme we talked about throughout this episode. But I'll have that up this week as well. And as always, we'll have the link to the GoFundMe for Larry Zonka's family in the show notes of this episode. So please continue to share and contribute if you can, and everything else you can find over at 411mania.com. Thanks as always for listening to the podcast, and we'll talk to you next time here on the 411 on Wrestling Podcast.